Public speaking is about communication, and there are different reasons why human beings communicate with each other. You want to get other people to do something or to provide what you want from them. Human beings are gregarious by nature, and relationships are very important. We do not want to be left behind by fellow human beings, by our group, so we also communicate to establish rapport. That's the why, but in public speaking, what matters is the how, right? So public speakers typically rely on words, language, in order to transfer contents or provide instructions. And the type of contents that are usually transferred are cognitive by nature, information, things your audience needs to learn about, understand. And of course, a very sophisticated speaker will try to make sure that his or her audience does not reject but will accept the contents or instructions the speaker is providing. So a sophisticated speaker will typically try to manage the emotional reactions, which are an important filter that will determine if people basically welcome or reject the type of contents that is made available to them. How is this typically done, and I've added stereotypically done? Well, over the last few decades, the most popular approaches to public speaking have been a mixture of neurolinguistic programming, meaning ways to package your contents, choosing the right words, ways of framing the message correctly, so that people react to the way things are framed and phrased. And then more recently with emotional intelligence, neutralizing the emotional bias and making sure emotions work in the speaker's favor and not against the speaker. There's hardly a voice coach or public speaking coach that will not talk about these aspects. But if you think about it, these aspects mainly pertain to two areas of the brain and the mind in general. When you're choosing the right words and framing your message correctly and applying NLP, you're basically relying on the very cognitive and rational aspects of language that are based and rooted in the cortex, the upper layers and the most and the newest, so to say, layers of our brain. When you're working to neutralize the emotional bias, maybe using emotional intelligence, you're making sure emotions work in your favor, not against you, and you're trying to diffuse something that is rooted in the limbic system where your emotions lie. And you're basically going to a place where fear, emotions, pleasure, rejection, and procedural learning are rooted. So there's a reason why public speaking coaches want you to address the emotional level, although there are risks involved in doing that, because the minute you go there, you have no idea what you will unleash in the head of your listeners. So there are pros and cons when it comes to leveraging emotions. And that's more or less the two levels you will basically be addressing if you frame communication in terms of providing cognitive contents and using a sort of lubricant for the cognitive engine of your mind, which is emotions. But the big question is, you can frame it the perfect way. You can use emotions marvelously to sort of help your audience digest it and accept it. But can you make people listen? How do you compete for your audience's attention? I mean, some of you are probably already reaching for their mobile phones. That's very typical of our age. We are stressed, distracted, overwhelmed with information, and we are very inattentive. So why should your listeners, why should your audience be listening to you? Why should your audience consider your message and mobilize their precious energy, attention for you, giving you priority over competing stimuli? I mean, your telephone has been buzzing and there's people around you and you're chatting to your neighbor perhaps, or thinking about your dog, your spouse, or whatever it is that you have at home. Attention, vigilance, wakefulness is what you need to leverage, but they are not primarily governed by the cortex or the limbic system. They have nothing to do with cognition or emotions. They are rooted elsewhere. They are part of an area of the human brain called the brainstem. It's an ancient part of the brain. It cannot think. It has no emotions, but it can sense. It is tied to the autonomic nervous system, the one that decides on fight or flight reactions, for instance, and the one that decides on rest and digest modes, self-healing, and down-regulation, for instance, of stress. It is tied to stretch sensors in your fascia, in your muscles, very, very widespread networks of receptors throughout your body and nervous system. It controls tone. It controls posture. It regulates breathing. It has a major role in proprioception, and it does one very, very important thing for any public speaker or artist. It does sensory gating. It means that it decides what stimulus will be given priority among the very many stimuli that are present in the room. We are awash with information, with sensory information all the time, and our brain constantly has to decide where our attention will go. And that's what your brainstem does. Now, having said this, let me discuss the classical theory of communication attributed to Albert Merhabian, who was the guy who came up with the idea that words matter in communication, but much more than words, tone of voice and body language have an important role to play. Now, he's famous, and he's usually quoted by public speaking gurus with a very easy formula saying that 7% of communication is words, 38% is tone of voice, and 55% is body language. Merhabian's formula and approach divides everything in words, which are cognitive, the verbal dimension, tone of voice. But what does tone of voice mean in Merhabian's studies? Well, he means prosody by tone of voice. Is this a statement? Is this a question? And it serves as an interpretation cue. It serves the cognitive aspect. It's meant to help you understand a cognitive message. And then body language. But body language to Merhabian means facial expressions. Merhabian never went into, whether you're keeping your legs crossed or gesticulating or using your hands in one way or another. He observed facial expressions. This is something I actually find pretty interesting, because I disagree with Merhabian, but I also agree with Merhabian. Merhabian focuses on the conscious aspects of communication, and the only partially unconscious aspect considered by Merhabian is emotions that are there as a lubricant, like I said earlier on, for cognitive aspects. And his theory ignores the role of the autonomic nervous system and the brainstem. Remember the one I mentioned earlier on, that determines how attentive, awake, and you will be, and how much priority you will give to the input you're receiving. He studied facial expressions. Facial expressions are rooted in the same nerves that go into your ears. So basically, the type of information facial expression carries, and that was so important to Merhabian in his experiments, also goes through your ears. There is an auditory side to body language, a type of body language we tend to ignore. Tone, talking brainstem regulated tone, is absolutely crucial when it comes to the voice. And when it comes to the inner body language of the voice itself, because the voice has an inner body language, which we call timbre. Timbre is the texture of a voice. It's the substance it's made of. If it were food, it would be the quality of the ingredients, the freshness of the ingredients. Whereas prosody, rhythm, the choice of words would be the way you arrange the food on your plate. Okay? Timbre is the product of the way your body is organized on the inside. It tells your listeners who you are and how you are on the inside, but literally, not metaphorically. And it is the unconscious body language of your inner organs and nervous system. It is 100% non-verbal and non-cognitive. It is connected with emotions, but it is not emotional in itself. So, tone of voice and body language, if you consider it that way, are one and the same thing. And they describe the submerged part of an iceberg, which usually constitutes more than 90% of the iceberg. In hearing a voice, you're basically hearing a manifestation of one person's inner organs and the way they are toned. Okay, so that's the real tone of voice. And it will basically stimulate arousal, vigilance, attention, wakefulness, or down-stimulate it. So remember when I asked the question earlier on, will the audience want to listen? Will they give priority to your message? Will they consider the stimulus that is coming from your side? Or will they gate it out and reach for their phones? When you listen into a voice, you're constantly shaking hands with the nervous system and the inner organs of the person who's speaking for perhaps 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You're collecting an enormous amount of non-verbal, non-cognitive, non-emotional information that enters your system through your mirror neurons.